Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Advancing Equity Through 100% Clean Energy. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance on behalf of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. And we have a very exciting roster of speakers with us today, who I will hand it over to soon. In the meantime, I'd like to go over just a few very quick webinar logistics. If you'd like to submit your comments, we would love to hear from you, your comments and your questions. So please type those in to the questions box on your webinar console and hit send, and we'll save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. And if you'd like to minimize your webinar console or expand it, the way that you do that is the little orange arrow that you see circled on the picture here. And yes, we are recording this webinar. We will send you a copy of the slides and the recording after the fact, and you can also find those on CESA's website. So with that, I am happy to present the moderator for today's webinar, my colleague, Anna Ziai. Anna is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and she is going to kick it off today.
Great, thank you, Sam. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Ziai, and I'm the Project Director of State Implementation of IRA and the BIL at the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. CESA is a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. CESA works with state leaders, federal agencies, industry representatives, and other stakeholders to develop clean energy programs and inclusive renewable energy markets. CESA members, mostly state agencies, include many of the most innovative, successful, and influential public funders of clean energy initiatives in the country. And you can see our members' logos right now on your screen. Next slide. The 100% Clean Energy Collaborative assists states and other entities that have 100% clean energy goals or are considering adopting such goals by providing knowledge sharing activities and analysis so that they can address program challenges and opportunities. The 100% Clean Energy Collaborative is managed by CESA in partnership with the U.S. Climate Alliance. Slide. The collaborative has been researching a number of state clean energy issues and has come out with several helpful reports on topics such as state legislation, plans, and reports on the clean energy transition, tables, timelines, and maps of clean energy states, and many other resources that you can find at the link cesa.org/100, and you can see some of those resources on this slide here. Next slide. Thank you. Today we're going to be talking about a recently released research paper authored by Charlies Hua reviewing the 100% clean energy plans for the 12 states that have already published plans. The paper outlines different states' approaches regarding the equity implications of climate impacts, proposed mitigation solutions, and planning and implementation processes, along with other equity-related considerations. It considers common themes and best practices and presents a selection of associated case studies and examples. The intention of analyzing the equity-related provisions from different states' clean energy plans is to make it easier for stakeholders to see different ways in which equity and environmental justice can be addressed in state energy planning efforts. And we hope that these considerations will make their way into future clean energy plans, strategies, and modeling studies. Next slide, please. So today we're lucky enough to be joined by two panelists who are going to be providing insight into the topics of this report. Our first speaker is is Dr. Tony Reames, and his presentation is going to be followed by the author of this paper, Charlies Hua, who I'll introduce momentarily. Dr. Tony Reames is the Deputy Director for Energy Justice at the U.S. Department of Energy. He leads the department's new Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis in the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. Dr. Reames was most recently an Associate Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, where he established the Urban Energy Justice Lab and the Energy Equity Project, focusing on research and solutions to the production and persistence of racial, income, and geographic energy-related disparities. Dr. Reames also served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and worked in both the private and public sectors as a licensed professional engineer. He earned a BS in civil engineering from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University and a Master's of Engineering Management from Kansas State University and a PhD in Public Administration from the University of Kansas. We're also joined by Charlies Hua, who's a research fellow here at CESA, helping to document and analyze state 100% clean energy plans with a focus on equity and environmental justice. He's a student at Harvard College studying statistics and mathematics with a minor in energy and environment. At Harvard, Charles serves on the Harvard Presidential Committee on Sustainability and is helping develop and write Harvard's forthcoming sustainability plan, and has previously advised Fortune 500 companies and international NGOs on sustainability and climate issues. He's also a policy analyst at Rewiring America and serves on the board of directors for environmental nonprofits Slipstream, Energy News Network, and Clean Wisconsin. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tony Reames. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Anna, and thank you all for the invitation to be with you today. So again, I'm the Deputy Director for Energy Justice at DOE, the second person to serve in this role, which I think allows us to really understand that we are taking this idea of energy justice seriously in this energy transition, which is why I want to open our talk today with thinking about how we move toward a more equitable and just energy future. Next slide, please. And so many of you know the administration's clean energy goal is twofold. By 2030, we want 80% of our energy generation from renewable and clean sources. And then 5 years later, the president has committed to 100% carbon-free electricity grid. And so with that, we are in 2023 and time is of the essence. And so you'll hear Secretary Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, say to meet these climate goals and clean energy goals, we have to deploy, deploy, deploy. Next slide, please. And so it's no surprise to anyone on the call today that the energy transition is here and it's happening. And we can see from our Energy Information Administration, over time, we can see just how our energy sources are changing and more renewables are coming online each and every year. And so EIA projects that by 2050, 40% on the same trajectory that we're on would be from renewables in our electricity system. But we know that the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act will help jumpstart that and put us on a new trajectory. Next slide. But we have to realize that as fast as the transition is happening, that we have to be deliberate in how that transition occurs. And we know that disparities and disproportionate barriers exist to clean energy access and adoption across racial groups, across income groups. And so the slide you see here today presents a couple of research papers that looked at racial disparities in rooftop solar adoption. On the left, we can see that the percentage of census tracts with or without rooftop solar is different across racial groups. And so in Black communities, about 47% of majority census tracts have no solar installations, compared to 24, 17, and 21% when we look across Hispanic, Asian, and white majority census tracts, respectively. And so we can ask, is it an issue of technical potential? Do we not have enough rooftops in majority African American communities, perhaps, to actually meet some parity in adoption? And the bar on the right shows that that's not the case. You can look at the median bar lines on each of those charts across census tracts with majority racial ethnic groups and no majority. And you see very similar averages, around 80, between 70 and 80% of households in majority census tracts have the rooftop potential. And so there's something else going on, some other policy solution, targeting solution, marketing solution that we need to address. Next slide. And we also see geographic disparities in both technical potential and rooftop penetration. And so this is a map of an earlier study from the District of Columbia, The darker areas are where you have the rooftop technical potential, the size of the roof, the tilt of the roof, to actually participate in rooftop solar programs. But you can see the concentration of that in areas where you actually have relatively less rooftop potential, but incomes are higher, more targeting and marketing is happening in that area. And you can see that play out in the percentage of households in different income bands that have adopted solar. Next slide. But in addition to disparities and barriers in access to renewable energy technology, we're also suffering an energy insecurity crisis, whether it's the inability of households to pay their bills and being shut off, the tsunami of shutoffs, utilities cutting off households for non-payment, and people suffering really exponentially during the pandemic. You can open your paper or your news app today and see people without power in Michigan, people without power in California. Anytime there's a storm, we see massive power outages. And so our infrastructure is also struggling. So you compare that with the move toward a more clean energy future, the disparities that exist in our energy system and clean energy adoption with this inability of people to even afford the energy that they use now. Next slide. And so again, people are unable to pay their bills. That continues to grow. People are foregoing basic necessities, choosing between heating or eating, and also keeping their homes at unhealthy temperatures because they can't afford the energy to heat or cool their home, or they can't afford to repair their systems. And so next slide. So our grand challenge is, how do we continue on this energy transformation, but at the same time, ensure that the transformation is more equitable and just? Next slide. And so in the first week of the Biden-Harris administration, President Biden signed Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, really setting the country on a path toward our clean energy future to address the issues of climate change. But in Section 223 of that order, it also created something known as the Justice40 Initiative. This is our opportunity to ensure that communities that have been left behind when it comes to environmental justice and energy justice are now at the front of the line to receive benefits from the federal investments in climate and clean energy investments. And so 40% of the benefits, at least, must go to disadvantaged communities. Next slide. And the Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, has taken that very seriously. She says that justice will serve as our North Star. And this is just a quick letter from her when we launched the Justice40 Initiative last year. Next slide. And so, relying on the pillars of energy and environmental justice, the department is really rethinking how we administer our programs, how we design our programs, everything from procedural justice, who's participating in our decision making, who's at the table when it comes to merit review, recognition justice, recognizing the needs of communities and how that should inform program design and implementation. Thinking about those distributive inequities that I talked about and how we actually focus on a place of equity when we deliver programs. And the goal is restorative justice, repair communities, make communities better than the system has in the past. Next slide. And so we're guided by 8 policy priorities that I think will be very relevant to the folks on the call today and to the report that Charles will discuss here lately. Our number one priority is thinking about reducing energy burdens. We must make energy more affordable, more accessible in disadvantaged communities. Reducing the environmental exposure and burdens that communities have suffered as a part of our current energy system. We want to increase parity when it comes to clean energy access and adoption. Also, giving access to low-cost capital. We know that it costs money to participate in this energy transition, whether it's for households or for businesses. And also, we want to create jobs and contracting opportunities for businesses in these disadvantaged communities, our minority business enterprises and other disadvantaged business enterprises. And then there's jobs. There's going to be jobs in the clean energy transition. So how do we ensure that the job pipelines are there, and the job training programs are in those communities. And then energy resilience and democracy, making communities more resilient in the face of climate change, but also delivering energy infrastructure that makes those communities resilient. And then democracy, participation in decision making, as well as new ownership models when it comes to the clean energy industry. Next slide. And so we need a new clean energy planning paradigm. I know Charles will talk about some of this today, but meaningful engagement across those 4 pillars of energy and environmental justice, centering equity and justice in our technology deployment. How do we optimize around things like affordability and access in ways that our models currently don't? Thinking about this from a place-based and regional approach. Also modeling and planning that breaks down technology silos. What is the right mix of clean energy technologies from storage and solar, wind, efficiency across places? And then taking a systems approach, a holistic integrated planning to our clean energy future. And I'll fly through these slides really quickly, and we can definitely share these with the attendees. But this is a model our team is working on in our Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis, where we understand the baseline energy burden across communities and then optimize around reducing those energy burdens either by 50% or below 6%. So we can see different scenarios of the mixes of technologies that could be deployed in a community. This could be baseline information for communities to think about their own plans for their clean energy futures, working with states and local governments and community groups to fine-tune that right mix of solar and wind and storage and efficiency, all centered around or optimizing reducing energy burdens. Next slide. And so the model we're working on could kind of deliver this type of roadmap for communities. If you're targeting your 80 to 100% AMI households to bring their energy burdens down, we can look at solar, look at community solar. How many buildings do we need to weatherize in a county? How much will this total investment cost? The jobs it will create, the bill savings, and then the average burden reduction. And so we look forward to working with folks in this space on fine-tuning this model over the next year. Next slide. And then another program we're super excited to introduce to folks who don't know about it is the 48E Inflation Reduction Act funded Low-Income Communities Bonus Credit Program, another program that our office will actually administer for IRS and U.S. Treasury. This allows us to, in a way that we haven't before, target low-income communities and low-income households, having them participate in this clean energy transition through rooftop solar, through community solar, through new ownership models. And so what this program does is provide an additional up to 20% credit on the existing low-income tax credit. And so 10% if you're locating in a low-income community census tract, 10% if you're locating on Indian land, up to 20% if you're locating on a low-income residential building project, thinking about multifamily affordable housing, and then 20% for a project that provides some additional type of economic benefit. And this is where we bring in new developers and new community ownership models to really drive an equitable clean energy transition. Next slide. Great. I look forward to the conversation after Charles's presentation, but thank you all again for your time.
Thank you very much. So I think we're going to pass it over to Charles now. Just give me a moment to get those slides up. Charles, I'll make you the presenter.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank Dr. Reames for the excellent overview of energy equity and environmental justice issues for the United States, and really thank the team at the Department of Energy and the Biden administration for really championing equity as a central component of the clean energy transition. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about sort of how we got here in terms of equity and environmental justice, how it became a central issue in the clean energy transition, and what states are doing to really prioritize equity and environmental justice. We're going to talk a little bit about the three-part equity framework that Dr. Reames alluded to earlier, and then discuss some next steps for states. So first, I just want to paint a picture about what energy equity and 100% clean energy has looked like in the United States. So if you look at this kind of visualization of what sort of state actions have been, there's been a lot of really aggressive action that states have taken over this past, really couple of years to pass bills and executive orders establishing 100% clean energy, either requirements or targets. And so states have taken a lot of really impressive actions, and now over half of the American population lives in a state that has passed 100% commitment or requirement. Now, states have taken different approaches to passing 100% clean energy. Some have prioritized legislation, so establishing legally binding requirements, and some states have relied on governors establishing executive orders to pass more voluntary commitments. And some states, including California, have taken both approaches, both establishing that North Star goal, but also passing legislation to firmly establish that commitment. Some 100% clean energy plans cover the entire economy in terms of getting to 100% clean energy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero, whereas some only cover the power sector. And they have different timelines. So the earliest timeline, ranges from 2033 for the state of Rhode Island, all the way up to 2050 for the state of Maine, Massachusetts, and others that you see on this chart below. And we're already seeing some states kind of re-up their commitments. For example, New Jersey, just within the last couple of weeks, Governor Phil Murphy pushed the timeline forward from 2050 to 2035 for the state to achieve 100% clean electricity. And a lot of that is spurred by the momentum from the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as looking at what other states have done to accelerate the clean energy transition. A lot of these states have established clear roadmaps for how to get to 100% clean energy. So you can see here, 12 of the states have clean energy plans. And this is going to be the bulk of our presentation today, is talking about what's in those plans, what are some of the common themes that we're seeing, and some of the best practices and recommendations for how states are tackling environmental justice. So as I mentioned, states are moving quickly. If you look at what's really happened over the past couple of years, whether you're looking at by the number of states or by the percentage of the American population that's covered under 100% clean energy, or by the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions in the US that are covered under states with these commitments, it's grown really fast. And now we're hitting the majority point in 2023 across these metrics. But one really important trend, which is the focus of our presentation today, is that equity and justice have become not side issues, but central issues to the clean energy transition. And so there's a couple kind of discrete events, but also a broad movement that's really existed for decades of advocates pushing for environmental justice issues to be increasingly centered and recognized in the clean energy transition. And we'll talk a little bit about why. But some of the key events include, for example, protests following George Floyd's murder, and a growing recognition around the relationship between social and racial equity and environmental issues. There's greater understanding from a scientific and policy standpoint about the impacts of industrial pollution and other pollution on communities, for example, in Cancer Alley, which is pictured in this image. And there's been a lot of grassroots mobilization from all sorts of folks, from the public, from nonprofit environmental groups, from elected officials, really pushing and clamoring for climate justice and environmental justice to be central issues in the clean energy transition. And so here's kind of a quick flip through of all the different pieces of legislation and executive orders that we reviewed. It was over 2,000 pages of these bills. And you can kind of see this trend of increasing mentions of equity and justice, especially in recent years. And today, we're going to be talking about what's in these pieces of legislation and executive orders. But first, you can quickly see at this chart that states are increasingly talking about equity and justice in these bills and executive orders. So the first time the word equity or justice was used in a bill or executive order was in 2019. And since then, the vast majority of these reports have, the vast majority of these bills and executive orders have talked about equity and justice. And that's just one component. But mentioning these in these bills creates legal and statutory requirements for different stakeholders to accelerate environmental justice in the clean energy transition. And so here are the 12 plans that we looked at across all these different states. And you can see that a lot of them, discuss equity and environmental justice quite prominently, particularly in some of the recent reports. And these trends reflect a broader societal interest as well. So if you look at kind of Google search terms for keywords like climate justice or just transition or environmental justice or social justice, especially in recent years, there's been a lot of increased momentum and societal interest in these issues. So now that gets us to the present point. So, one of the difficult or sort of contentious issues has been, how do you define environmental justice? Because really there's many different ways that can be defined. And frankly, states use a variety of different terms to refer to this kind of broader theme that we're talking about in terms of a just and equitable transition. But you'll see states use terms like equity or environmental justice or climate justice. And then from the community standpoint, you'll see the terms disadvantaged community, overburdened community, underserved community, marginalized community, vulnerable populations. And so there's all these different terms, but the definitions typically revolve around factors such as income in particular, as well as race, in addition to other factors like geography, gender, age, sexual orientation, disability status, and different health and environmental impacts, such as your proximity to a source of major pollution. And again, there's different terms: energy justice, climate justice, environmental justice, and they all refer to slightly different concepts, but they're all related, because you can't have environmental justice if climate change is disproportionately impacting certain communities. And that's where climate justice comes in. But you can't have climate justice if certain populations are left behind in the clean energy transition, they receive underinvestment, and they suffer from high energy burdens. So to accelerate a just transition, we really need to focus on all these different pillars: energy justice, environmental justice, climate justice. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So there's a three-part framework to provide some structure behind how we're organizing this discussion and the report. And this was really inspired by the work of the Initiative for Energy Justice, which was formerly led by Shalonda Baker, now at the US Department of Energy, as well as some work that the DOE has previously done around this issue. And it's a three-part framework around recognition justice, so understanding that certain communities have disproportionately suffered from the consequences of climate change, and understanding that these climate impacts are going to affect different populations in different ways. There's distributional justice, so that's looking at embedding equity in the solutions. So when we're talking about investment or programs or policies that are meant to accelerate clean energy or climate solutions, how do we make sure that those solutions reach the populations that have historically been left out, but actually create greater environmental justice and remediate some of these previous injustices? And then finally, the piece that Dr. Reames briefly mentioned is procedural justice. How do we embed equity into the processes around clean energy planning or implementation? So that's things like, how do we get more diverse representation on the stakeholder, across the stakeholder groups, as well as the governance bodies that have the real decision-making power in determining how this clean energy transition takes shape. So let's start with that first piece, which is recognition justice. So if you look at the chart on the left, that's from a EPA study in 2021, the Climate Change and Social Vulnerability in the United States study. And that was sort of this landmark report showing that, as folks are already aware, that low-income communities and communities of color disproportionately suffer from the current and the future consequences of climate change. And that ranges from environmental and health impacts, such as childhood asthma rates. That also refers to economic impacts like temperature, labor hours lost due to decreased productivity, or property loss. And that also refers to, more generally speaking, social and environmental impacts. And so across all these key impact areas, we see the same recurring trend, is that low-income communities and minority communities have a greater likelihood of living in areas that are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. And you can see with this visualization on the right here, for example, a lot of communities, live or are closely sited next to major sources of industrial pollution. And that didn't happen by accident, right? That was intentional policy and investment choices that led to those outcomes. So recognition justice fundamentally aims to understand that these communities have been impacted differently and do something about it. So for recognition justice, nearly all 12 states that we considered in this report, based on states that have passed or established plans, generally acknowledge the disproportionate environmental, health, and economic burdens that these populations face. And again, different plans use different terms, vulnerable communities or disadvantaged communities, but most states generally acknowledge this exists. And most of these states acknowledge income as a key factor. So socioeconomic status, looking at lower income individuals pay a greater percentage of their income on energy. It's called energy burden. And so figuring out how these impacts affect these different communities differently is an important part of a lot of these state plans. And many, but not most states, explicitly call out race and histories of racial discrimination and systemic racism as a key factor. So for example, the New York Scoping Plan mentions that race is one of the biggest predictive factors in New York for who bears a disproportionate burden of climate change impacts. And that's due to historical legacies around marginalization, redlining, segregation. And these things cumulatively have created disproportionate impacts in terms of, again, where a lot of these fossil projects are sited, the location of a lot of these communities, and things like energy burden. A few states specifically reference historical legacies around Indigenous and Native American populations and the relationship with state and federal governments. So for example, the Louisiana Climate Action Plan calls out that these communities have been disproportionately impacted from various health issues, yet they also have a very fundamentally deep understanding of ecosystems, species, and the local terrain. A few states refer to the different ways in which communities have suffered from underinvestment and have missed opportunities for wealth building. And that's a crucial piece, is that when you think about creating a just and equitable transition, it's not leaving behind these communities that have historically been underinvested in. It's bringing them along and allowing them to build wealth in part through clean energy investment. And finally, other plans talk about sort of other things in terms of language barriers, the COVID-19 pandemic, mental health disparities that different groups face. But again, there's this general emphasis on ways in which these communities have suffered from the consequences of climate change. So now let's shift to talking about distributional justice. So distributional justice manifests itself in many ways. When we look at diversity statistics around who makes up the clean energy workforce, or as Dr. Reames mentioned, where adoption of these clean energy technologies and these distributed energy resources takes place, oftentimes there's a disproportionately lower adoption rate for disadvantaged communities. And so that's what that middle chart shows, is that solar adoption in disadvantaged communities has historically lagged the total percentage of all US households that live in these communities. And that trend is improving, but in order to make sure that we rectify this issue, it needs to pick up even faster. And so this is really the meat of how states are tackling equity in their clean energy plans. So many states express an overarching need to embed equity in the implementation of their clean energy plans. And that's through policies, investments, programs that are targeted at communities that have historically been left out or marginalized, and making sure that the benefits and the investments reach these communities so that there are better health, economic, social, and environmental outcomes. For a lot of states, investment is the biggest lever that they see to advance equity. And so that's where things like the Justice40 Initiative under the Biden administration comes into play, is that some states are proposing that at least 40% of funding or benefits of investment related to climate solutions to directly benefit these communities. And that these programs are developed in partnership with a lot of these communities that have historically been left out in the clean energy planning processes. Beyond that, it's also things like workforce development. And so to build a robust and diverse clean energy workforce, oftentimes states really want to emphasize diverse representation in the clean energy workforce, as well as targeting HBCUs or targeting technical schools and expanding the base of who is participating in this clean energy transition. So there's 4 key sectors that most of these state plans address. It's energy, transportation, buildings, and agriculture. So let's dive into the weeds about what states are doing. So to decarbonize energy and embed equity in these efforts, states are promoting greater investment, like I mentioned with the Justice40 Initiative. States are maximizing distributed energy resources, recognizing that beyond just looking at the cheapest kilowatt hour of energy through utility scale solar, for example, that there's often co-benefits of rooftop solar or community solar in terms of making sure that certain communities reach and receive all these benefits that we're talking about. It's clean energy financing mechanisms. So rather than relying on tax credits where certain communities have been historically left out due to inability to access the full tax credit due to a lack of tax liability to that degree, it's things like rebates or grants or other equitable clean energy financing mechanisms that ensure that communities receive these benefits. It's technical support, it's job training, and it's targeting the transition from fossil fuel facilities to clean energy projects based on environmental justice considerations. So retiring the fossil fuel plants that are located in environmental justice communities. It's energy efficiency programs. It's creating robust data and dashboards and metrics to ensure proper measurement and accountability of these efforts. To decarbonize transportation in an equitable fashion, states are providing financial assistance for low-income residents to purchase electric vehicles and e-bikes, in addition to promoting public transit, investing more in public transit, or even offering free public transit. It's investing in EV charging infrastructure in underserved communities, developing a clean transportation standard that prioritizes emissions reduction in these communities. And again, it's retiring the highest emitting vehicles that disproportionately lead to respiratory health issues and other health conditions based on environmental justice considerations. It's looking at road usage charges like congestion pricing. Now, to talk about equity in building decarbonization, states are building benchmarking and labeling programs to focus on improving building upgrades in environmental justice communities. It's scaling up investment in heat pump solutions. Again, transitioning away from delivered fuels for environmental justice communities towards electrified options leads to better health outcomes and creates jobs and improves energy costs. It's changing building codes and regulations to prioritize low and moderate income customers. It's technical assistance, financial assistance, and it's affordable and public housing. And finally, it's also looking at weatherization assistance programs and providing more funding in addition to targeting workforce development and training and utility ratepayer programs and making sure that they align with the needs of these communities. To decarbonize agriculture, states are increasing tree canopy, improving equitable land management, promoting soil health and climate resiliency, and diversifying the base of farmers, and establishing equitable regional composting. And so to close out this kind of section around distributional justice, states are also developing monitoring and enforcement programs to ensure that air quality is being measured in these communities and that the health and economic impacts that we talked about actually reach the communities. Adaptation is also an important component where states are looking at which communities are most likely to be flooded and prioritizing adaptation investments in those communities. It's centering race in policy design, so making sure that the investments and the policies actually reach these communities that are disproportionately affected. And it's looking at siting and permitting processes, so embedding environmental justice in where these projects are located. There's other innovative solutions. I'll speed through this. So resilient local land use practices, it's cap and invest programs, directing investments towards disadvantaged communities. It's equity and waste solutions, so reducing the waste held by waste management facilities in disadvantaged communities. And it's promoting education within state agencies and state and local governments around issues of systemic racism and energy and environmental justice. And it's creating offices of environmental justice. So Washington has a good 7-step framework that folks can refer to. It's in the report that outlines sort of a process for how to achieve distributional justice. And lastly, I'll just go really quick and talk about procedural justice, and we'll leave more time in the Q&A to discuss this as well. But states acknowledge that it's important for stakeholder engagement to target these low-income communities and communities of color, right? And so it's ensuring things like making sure that meetings are held not only during 9 to 5 hours, and that there's greater language accessibility that are culturally appropriate. It's having more diverse representation in the clean energy planning processes. So being intentional about making sure that folks representing environmental justice communities actually are allowed to serve on these bodies that decide how the clean energy transition will be implemented. It's advisory groups. And it's also clearly defining terms. Like we said, a lot of ambiguity has existed around how to define environmental justice terms previously, but having very clear, robust definitions ensures that the communities that are meant to be targeted and reached actually are done so in practice. And then finally, it's creating assessment processes to make sure that, again, these communities that are most affected actually receive the benefits using different health and environmental assessment tools. So lastly, to close out, in terms of next steps, states should prioritize equity and clean energy planning through all of the options that we discussed today. They should deliberately engage with communities and populations that are underrepresented and understand why they have been underrepresented in the past. And there's this one kind of quote that I read in one of the plans that gets at the idea that just because you have an open public meeting doesn't mean that that is intentionally targeting these communities that have been left out of the planning processes. It's very important to make sure that there's deliberate intention behind engagement. It's proposing policies and solutions that address energy burdens and economic and health impacts through investments, solutions, and policies and programs. And it's ensuring that future clean energy planning doesn't reproduce or exacerbate existing climate injustices. And finally, it's developing new and improved measurement and accountability frameworks to make sure that progress is accurately tracked and that these efforts are implemented expediently. So there's 2 reports that get at this. We're focusing on the second one today, which is looking at climate action plans and 100% clean energy plans for states. But there's also a report that we published last year that looks at the same issue, but in the context of legislation and executive orders. So with that, I will open up the floor for Q&A and then I'll pass it back.
Hi, great. Thank you, Charles. That was excellent. And I'm just going to dive right into the questions for the sake of time. Some of them are a little more specific and some are more general. So I'll start with the specific ones. Our audience is excited to hear more about the new community ownership models that are going to be promoted by the new legislation. And so Dr. Reames, this question is for you. Do you have an update as to when more details about that program and how it's going to be designed and implemented implemented will be released. So the questions are asking whether these new ownership models apply largely to large utility scale, wind and solar facilities, or just smaller community projects. Do you have an update as of yet for that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there are multiple programs where we are trying to signal this idea of community ownership from different types of technologies. And so the 48E community, low-income community bonus credit program allows for developers to target communities, but part of the deeper impact evaluation of applications will be basically the tenets and pillars of energy and environmental justice that we talked about. Procedural justice, how are communities participating in these new programs, new targeting of low-income communities, low-income housing, but also how are communities actually benefiting from this. And so community ownership models is one of the signals that we are pushing in this program. You'll also see this in other funding opportunities outside of the department. We've thought about this in our rural and remote programs, and so you'll see signaling in those funding opportunities and those competitive grants, thinking about it across the supply chain for offshore wind and community wind. And so that's just a new signal for the department to think through how Justice 40 is made real. And so Charles talked about wealth creation. And so everything from supporting new business enterprises to making sure that communities can do this in a place-based way and actually own some of the technology and infrastructure that's being built.
That's great. And you mentioned 48E. Another audience member would like to know whether the DOE Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis will be the entity that releases additional guidance for this piece of legislation.
So DOE is the administrator of the program, which means we're setting up the application process and the review process. And then we make recommendations to Treasury and IRS about the merits of projects that come in. So we're the administrator for the program and work very closely with IRS and Treasury on the guidance. And so initial guidance was released on February 13th. Additional guidance will be coming out soon.
That's great. Thank you. And another question is, where, Charles or Dr. Reames, where do you recommend that states draw their definitions of vulnerable and disadvantaged communities from in order to achieve more success and inclusivity in their state plans? Like, are there any pros and cons of uniformity among these definitions?
Yeah, I can take that. I think that's a really great question. There's definitely trade-offs because one advantage of uniformity is that if everyone aligns to a federal definition, there's very clear expectations and standards for which communities are prioritized. Now, the downside of that is communities are very different in every state. So when we talk about, for example, indigenous communities, that means very different things in Massachusetts versus Wisconsin versus Louisiana. And so that's the danger of having a one-size-fits-all definition, is that it doesn't get at the particularities of an existing state. And so, one model that some states have chosen is that they've defined the definitions of equity and environmental justice in partnership with the communities in that region. So, working with the environmental justice communities to figure out what does that actually mean. And that's looking at things like race, income, geography, proximity to fossil pollution or health and environmental impacts, but it's done in a collaborative manner. But our hope with the report is that there's a database that you can look at to reference for what other states are doing around that.
That's great, thank you. And Dr. Reames, do you have anything to add on that, or?
Yeah, that was a great explanation, Charles. And again, this is a great question and one that we've grappled with at the federal level for some time. Many of you may know that the most recent version of the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool was released, which is the federal government's attempt to identify communities that have certain challenges across income and other socioeconomic and environmental characteristics that make them more vulnerable to climate change, but also provide opportunities to participate in the kind of clean energy, energy efficiency, and other areas of trying to tackle the climate crisis. And so all federal agencies will transition to that tool by FY24, which is October of this year. DOE created a tool in the interim while we were waiting on the climate and economic justice screening tool that really looks at national data on energy vulnerabilities. And so we will release a process where the climate and economic justice screening tool is established as the kind of the baseline of understanding communities, but then our tool will allow you to do some additional screening to identify certain characteristics of communities that may be addressed by different programs. And so, as Charles was mentioning, I think there's, an understanding of communities that share certain characteristics based on nationally available data. But then how do we dig a little deeper, either learning from those communities or looking at additional data sets to target solutions to the characteristics that exist in communities. And so I don't know if it's an exclusive process, but a more nuanced process that we go through to identify communities and work with communities.
Great, thank you. And then we have a few questions here about the basic technology development process. And essentially, technologies are in development that are driven to cater to early adopters. And this has an enduring influence on things like product design and distribution channels and marketing. But the problem is that early adopters are almost always represented by wealthy people and entities who can afford the risk. And so this often results in technology development where serving disadvantaged communities just kind of becomes an afterthought. And so this is another issue for disadvantaged community adoption. So are there any specific or additional initiatives that can make disadvantaged communities the focus of new climate technology development rather than afterthoughts that either states can help implement or from the federal level would help with this process?
Oh, okay, I'll jump in real quick, Charles, and then pass it to you. I think that is, kind of the crux of how we shift to this idea of energy justice and energy equity. And so if you look at some of the Department of Energy Earthshots, you will see now this idea of thinking about communities at the beginning of the planning process, thinking about the needs of communities, engaging communities in the design of these kind of last challenges of our clean energy transition. And so as we think about, say, something as simple as building upgrades, right? Building retrofits, our hardest to reach building type in that sector, in the residential sector, is multifamily. And so if we're trying to come up with packages for retrofit, why don't we start with affordable multifamily housing and actually design retrofit packages around that building type that looks at the cost, that looks at accessibility, looks at the technology, then we can scale from there. And so we've been doing a lot of discussions about how we center the most difficult or hard to reach, however we describe it, households and communities in our technology design. And those discussions are ongoing, but they do kind of shift the framing of how people think about the technology readiness level, where we are on that continuum, to attack those problems first. And so I think the understandings are changing in the department, and those conversations are happening a lot more. And we'd love to partner with states kind of on that approach.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. And if we think about sort of this idea of advanced energy technologies and innovation, I mean, historically, oftentimes the test bed for some, polluting technologies has frankly been in these environmental justice communities that we're talking about. And so when we actually look at what stakeholder feedback looks like for a lot of states, a lot of these communities, express severe kind of hesitation towards technologies like hydrogen or carbon capture or other sort of quote unquote advanced nuclear or other advanced energy technologies. So from a policymaker standpoint, I think what some states have done, for example, California, as part of their energy modeling, has looked at a scenario where there's no combustion, right? Because that's something that the Disadvantaged Community Advisory Group recommended, is that a lot of these communities don't want a scenario where there is still combustion of any sort. And I think a lot of that is being very intentional about, from a planning standpoint at the state level, what sort of energy technologies are being considered in the planning. It's also requiring utilities to look at environmental justice impacts of their investment decisions. And for example, what Dr. Reames alluded to with the Department of Energy Earthshot initiatives, that's something that I would celebrate as an area where, for example, the hydrogen Earthshot, one of the hydrogen hubs, for those hydrogen hubs, a big focus is environmental justice. So I think it's about being intentional about what technologies are being prioritized, how they fit into the 100% clean energy planning scenario for that state, and making sure that these communities actually have a say in that process.
Great, thank you. And I'll ask one more question and give either of you time to respond, and then I'll pass it over to Sam, who I see a lot of questions in here about how these people can access this presentation's recording and the slides, and she's going to get to you about that once our Q&A session is finished. And essentially, we're wondering about states where the incumbent utility is a monopoly and not amenable to community ownership models, and then the state also has no enabling legislation for such models. What advice do you both have for states like that trying to assist low to moderate income stakeholders with accessing alternative energy options? And I know this is the case in states such as Michigan, where Dr. Reames, you have familiarity with, obviously, and have done a lot of research about. So do you guys have any insights into an issue like that?
I'll let you jump in on this one first, Charles.
Sure. So this is an excellent question. And I think I'll actually take part of that question, which is getting legislation passed that requires public utility commissions to then require utilities to consider environmental justice impacts. So, some states, for example, Washington, have done this effectively, where as part of their Clean Energy Transformation Act, part of that 100% clean energy bill is requiring utilities, as part of their integrated resource plans, to actually look at environmental justice impacts. So I think that's actually a crucial component, is looking at changing up the way that PUCs regulate. So it's changing who serves on these commissions. It's changing how these commissions regulate. So instead of just looking at a sort of more narrow security, reliability, and affordability mandate, it's getting them to start thinking about how climate change and environmental justice starts fitting in. So that's taking what they currently have and reinterpreting sort of the statutory authority that they're given. But then it's also passing legislation through state legislatures that actually require PUCs and public utility commissions to more directly embed equity in their regulatory authority.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up with, we are trying to do that through either signaling or policy priority factors and funding to utilities. And so many of you will see in a lot of our funding opportunities this new component called the Community Benefits Plan, where it is requiring applicants for federal funding to think through benefits that they deliver to disadvantaged communities and how they ensure that they are not adding additional or they're mitigating environmental burdens on communities. And so it's through these opportunities to actually put the signaling and funding that can then be matched or complementary to legislation and regulation at the state level.
That's great. I want to thank you both so much for your excellent presentations and your time today in answering these questions, and everyone else who attended the meeting today. I'm going to turn it over now to Sam, who's going to wrap us up and show you how to get some more resources. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. So if you have any follow-up questions, there's contact information for Anna and Charles on your screen. We got a lot of questions we couldn't get to, but thank you so much for participating, everyone. If you'd like to see a recording of this webinar or see the slides, we did record it. We'll be posting all of those materials either this afternoon or tomorrow, and we'll send you a follow-up email with all of those materials. You can also find them on our website at CESA.org. And before you leave, I just wanted to let you all know about a couple of upcoming webinars that we will have in March. You can see details about those on our screen. We hope you'll attend. The topics for both of those are energy storage, and we'll also have more 100% clean energy collaborative webinars coming up. So we hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you all again for attending and participating. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Yeah.